Corruption, good governance, red tape. And then we have a target, the miracle of Asia by 2016. Can we really achieve this target by the year 2016, or is it going to be just numbers that we are going to talk about? To discuss all this and more, I have a special guest this evening who is no stranger to the show. He is the chairman of Transparency International Sri Lanka, Mr. J.C. Valyamana. So starting off, what is your take, Mr. Valyamana, with regard to good governance in Sri Lanka? Let's talk about the post-war period since 2009.
Well, let me start by saying that governance and good governance are two different things. Governance is the structure on which a government or a state governs, that is institutions and so on and so forth. Good governance is a real upper layer of that which requires to address some openness in it, then transparency, anti-corruption. That is a bigger achievement to reach. Well, in Sri Lanka, even after the post-war period, there was no major achievements in that area. I mean, one would expect the conclusion of the war to give a space for government to address these issues and make governance a good governance. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. That is our complaint. There was a great opportunity, but we lost the opportunity because I don't think government invested in good governance at all. They used this opportunity to concentrate power.
Opportunity, is it the post-war era that you're talking about?
Yes, I am talking about post-war era.
Let's talk about corruption, red tape in the government sector. This has been very rampant and you have been very, very vocal on these issues over the last few years. What is your take? What is the right path that the government should take in order to address and arrest this issue immediately?
Well, you are asking a very vital question, but it's very difficult to answer that question into just 2-3 words. But let me tell you that in my view, the present challenge is we have not only bad governance, we have a situation where there is a state capture. When I say state capture, it has a meaning. That means all the institutions, including the regulatory mechanisms in Sri Lanka, have been captured by a group of people. So when that happens, you need to rescue the governance structure from the clutches of those who have captured. So that's a political game, which I'm not a politician, but we also have certain views on that. But in addition to rescuing the governance structure out of this clique, we also need to strengthen the institutions. It is not a question of just one individual or two individuals or one institution or two institutions. We need to look at the bigger picture. How have the other countries who have been successful in mitigating or reducing corruptions face the situations? We have very good examples in Asia, in other countries and so on and so forth. Even in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka was not as corrupt as today before. What I see is
but there was corruption at that time.
Well, there has been corruption, and there is evidence that even during Sinhala King's time there were corruption. I mean, that is why the literature shows that there was special mechanism used even at that time to fight corruption or battle corruption. But the issue of corruption is such that you should be able to manage. It's well, let's understand what corruption is. Actually, corruption has been defined world over basically to mean abuse of power for private gain. You have power, you abuse that power for personal gain. So that is where the corruption is, not the exercise of power. Abuse of power for personal gain. When you have power, whether it is the head of the state or anyone else, or the private sector, public sector, or religious institutions or media institutions, when you abuse those powers, then it becomes corruption. You need to understand that where you talk about corruption, you are talking about various forms of corruption. It is not only bribery. Unfortunately, people have a tendency in Sri Lanka to consider corruption as bribery. Well, bribery is one form of corruption, but there are bigger forms now, conflict of interest, insider dealings.
Now, you find institutions in Sri Lanka like the allegations of bribery or corruption in the country, then you have the Human Rights Commission. What are you trying to say? You are a lawyer. You think these institutions are defunct at the moment?
What I am saying is corruption cannot be addressed only by one or two institutions in the first place. There has to be overall strategy to fight corruption in a country. In Sri Lanka, that's a political layer which does not address, which I must say, although people have different views, that Sri Lankan government or the political structure has no priority to fight corruption. That's one. Secondly, even the institutions which have been vested with authority to fight corruption has no teeth and also required independence. You take the bribery commission in Sri Lanka or the commission to look into allegations of bribery or corruption. We call it bribery commission. What do they have? I mean, they don't have a sufficient financial independence to recruit even specialist investigations. Therefore, they completely rely on police officers who have been temporarily released to them to investigate. So that is one. Second issue is, actually, I have never seen in the country where, in the world, I can tell you with my own experience, I have studied about 50-60 countries where they battle corruption, where the retired public officials run the anti-corruption institutions. Now here retired judges and retired investigators, I mean they are 65 years and so on and so forth. Some of them may be good in looking at it, but most of them, they have, I think, burnt out in my respectful view. But what I say is that you need to have agile, mid-career people with integrity to fight corruption. I think retired judges are not the people in my view. So then there is no impetus to fight corruption. And also,
do we have the right people to fight corruption in Sri Lanka?
Of course. I must say that if you look at independently about the caliber of Sri Lankans, we have an enormous talent to fight corruption. There are people who are willing to fight corruption, sacrifice themselves to fight corruption and so on and so forth. But in the present malgovernance system, the president has to pick up people for those positions. And who are the people who have been chosen? Not the people who really want to fight corruption, who will toe the line with the government. The criteria is very clear that you have to be with the government politically and to support the political leadership. Then and then only you are appointed to those positions. If you go on merit, Sri Lanka is a country, in my view, there is an enormous talent. I mean, I have seen various professionals, I have seen non-professionals who are really committed and they do understand fighting corruption. Even in the police department, I mean, we are very critical of the police department, but there is a section of police department, if they are left alone, if they are independent, they will be able to crack down any crime in the country, provided there is no political interference.
Now we're talking about corruption, we're talking about red tape, we are talking about bribery, allegations against the government. Does this really affect the forward march of the country? Because there is development taking place in the country, there is infrastructure development taking place. We see a southern port, a southern international airport being built, roads are extremely good. From Colombo to Jaffna, it just takes a few hours to reach the destination. There is development taking place in Sri Lanka.
Well, there are a couple of things that we need to be very clear. Development is one thing, corruption is another thing. There are certain areas which are overlapping. Let me explain when I say this. We have examined, including Transparency International and so many academic institutions and economists have gone into the ill effects of corruption vis-a-vis development. There are few findings, scientific findings. One is that if there is no corruption, this development can increase by many folds. For example, if someone is taking 20% of that development money, so you add that 20% into development, you can see much more development. That is one. Secondly, this development is very important, but you have to prioritize, because otherwise the investment in development by itself can be a corruption.
Prioritize, what does that mean?
Now, I'll take for example, I mean, my argument is that you take Mattala Airport. It's a airport, addition of a airport in a small country. Maybe one can argue that we should have 2-3 international airports. Well, if you want to have 2-3 airports, probably you have to look at viable places. Something like Palal, in my view, probably is more viable.
You're looking at making Sri Lanka the miracle of Asia by 2016.
Let me see. Let me tell you. Let me meet that argument. The issue of having in Mattala airport, we have seen so far no progress. I mean, I have come in a plane which was landed there. Only one person got down. Some Chinese guy got down and another Chinese guy got in. I mean, that's all. in that plane. And what is the total capital cost? Sri Lankans, every one of us will have to pay for it. These are not airports that have been built on our own money. These are on lendings, long term but higher interest loans, which every one of us to pay, and also our next generations to pay. I think the purpose of such a investment, you need to look at whether there's any corrupt motives, political motives, or whether in fact it was intended to make a country a miracle of Asia. I think every one of us would like to see Sri Lanka become a miracle of Asia. And you look at the investments that are being made on Mihin Lanka, for example, and so on and so forth. I don't have to waste time in giving you figures, but we all know that a huge amount out of our public money is spent on running those institutions and so on and so forth. And also, there is, we were talking about these anti-corruption institutions and all that. None of them have been capable of looking into this, let alone Parliament.
Let's talk about the COPE report in a bit. The government always stresses the fact that Rome was not built in a day. It takes time. Similarly, projects like the Southern International Airport will reap benefits in the future. But you are being very pessimistic about these projects.
No, I am not pessimistic about all the projects. I can tell you that I have seen the huge development in terms of infrastructure vis-a-vis roads. Everybody likes it. But we also, as citizens of this country, should know what exactly the cost of that. I mean, that is where the governance differs from good governance. I mean, people should participate. Now, for example, if you take the Northern Road, Northern A9 nicely being built, I think people love to have it. And also this Yal Devi going to Jaffna, anybody should welcome. I mean, let's not have reservations on that. But at the same time, if the Jaffna Road actual cost is half, less than half of what has been spent, what do we say? Are we saying that that is also good? I think what we should do is that this development must come under scrutiny, and then when you combine the two, then there will be a huge support for the progress of this country. I mean, what is unfortunately seen is that those critical voices are looked down upon and they are condemned by the government. They should understand that critical voices are also critical partners of the government. I mean, that is unfortunately is not the case. And when you criticize, and even parliamentarians when they raise these issues, we were watching on TV and also in literature how the government is responding. They don't want critics. So when there are no critics and there is development, I have my hesitations, because that means there is something to hide.
How important is it to have a Right to Information Act in Sri Lanka? How important is it, in your opinion?
Well, it's very, very important. That's one of the critical issues where Sri Lanka is struggling to get into good governance status. One reason is that people have inherited in Sri Lanka from 1940s and so on and so forth, certain set of laws which is very restrictive in information. I mean, those are the laws that were brought in by British. At that time in England, there was huge restrictions on information, because the government, they thought, is something which works without being open. I mean, that was how it was. But England, they have moved away from that and became open governance in 1960s. 70s, everything is virtually open, and transparency in governance was established. But we never changed with that. Although we got independence, we were still hiding behind those laws. I'll give you one example. Now, in the Establishments Code, which we are basically enjoying at the moment, which is the rule of the public servants. All the public servants are subjected to provisions of the Establishments Code vis-a-vis their conduct and discipline. There are few provisions in the public Establishments Code which prohibits public servants from disseminating information. But that was there for the British at that time. That was relevant for British to operate from outside. But Brits have changed. So are all the other countries in the world, most of the countries in the world, most certainly in the South Asia. Now, what we have done is we are still relying on that to restrict information. If people don't know information, we don't have access to information, they either guess or they have no way of participating. And also, thirdly, if the state is restrictive, then the issue is that people are not part of that structure. We have to understand one thing. One, there are so many logics, so many justifications for Right to Information Act or Freedom of Information, I would call it Right to Information Act. In India, when there was a huge movement to introduce Right to Information Act, it started with one logic actually. The logic is that people's representatives are in parliament, right? So let's understand that people's representatives are in parliament. So that's why we call our representative. Now who is the big person in that, representative or rep or the principal? It's the principal, the citizens. So citizens have our representatives sent to parliament. Now the citizens representative have access to everything. So but not the people who send them to parliament. Right? So, I mean, even in commercial law, actually it is in commercial law that has developed this idea of representation. So, we have seen in our world, in commercial world, that if you have a business establishment, if you cannot outreach, you send your representatives. That's why you call it reps or business reps. So, those are the reps. Actually, the businessman is the owner of that. Like that even in democracy, owners are the people. We are sending these representatives to parliament. So, but they have access to information, but the demand in India was that if any information is available to parliament, people should have access.
The lawyers fraternity has a big role to play. There is archaic laws in Sri Lanka, as you did mention before. However, the impact that is being created by the lawyers fraternity in Sri Lanka is very, very minimal. What is the reason behind this? You too are a lawyer.
I must say that lawyers are to some extent responsible because lawyers are although forming part of the political community in Sri Lanka. But from time to time, if you look at other professionals, lawyers have been active. Now today, you take the Bar Association or our own collective of lawyers collective, they are all taking up these issues and pushing.
But where is the impact?
Well, the impact depends on how the governments respond, because you will see that there is no marginal impact on many of the governance.
Does the government take the Bar Association or even the lawyers collective serious?
Government doesn't take anyone serious. Government doesn't take parliament serious. Government doesn't take scientists serious. Government doesn't take the opposition serious. Government doesn't take anyone serious. The reason is that there's a state capture. When there is a state capture, I mean, all the Middle East and North African countries have experienced this revolutions recently, a kind of revolution, and where the dictators were there. I mean, during those dictators period, and where this is one thing common is the state capture. Those in the state capture situations, there will not be huge impacts. You have to still keep pressing. I think I would say that we have been able to mainstream certain issues. Now, certain issues in the sense we have been able to mainstream, like Transparency International and few organizations and the lawyers have managed to mainstream anti-corruption struggle in Sri Lanka. Earlier, anti-corruption discourse was there only for the politicians during elections, but that is not the case now. And also, today, yes, the government will not respond to, but they don't want to be caught in this corruption.
It's a democratic country. The people have the right to remove the government if they wishes to. However, since 2009 up until 2014, majority of the elections have been won by the ruling party. The people are endorsing the acts of the government. The people want the government to be there. Example, let's take a look at the Uva Provincial Council elections. The government recorded a victory there as well. The people need them. The people want the government. They endorse the activities of the government. What is your take on this?
My take is very clear. There was a time, I think before 1974-75 period, the particularly Western world and this democratic world thought the only yardstick where the democracy is measured is to see whether there are elections periodically in a country. But that's not the case. Now, what is more important is what happened in between elections. It is not only elections. Elections, the elections is fought not only on these issues. There are certain other things, and we know how elections are fought here. All state resources are abused, and election is by itself is not democratic. It's not an electoral election. It's a war in every election. So that's one aspect. But election is measured. How governments behave, democracy is measured. How governments behave in between elections, whether people can participate, whether there's openness in governance, whether there's media freedom, whether there is investments for businessmen, and so on and so forth. Now, unless you have all these things, you don't say it's a democratic country. That is why in almost all the international yardsticks, and in fact there are so many organizations which have worked on measuring democracy in certain countries. Sri Lanka fairly unfortunately very badly, although we have so much of talent. This is certainly not South African countries where people have not experienced fully fledged democracy. We have seen, and there are also people in Sri Lanka with so much of talent who value democracy, and any given time they value democracy. So in that context, I would say that your suggestion, your proposition that democracy is endorsement by people, that is part of it. But we also know how elections are fought, and UA is a classic example. We have seen in the north our government was unsuccessful with all the manipulations and electoral frauds. Government couldn't win in the north. Even in the UA province, I am not a politician, but my looking at the results is that the government has gone back in a massive way.
There is no victory or defeat.
Yes.
You cannot define a line between victory and defeat in politics. So the government obviously had a victory at the UA Provincial Council polls.
At a very high cost, and all the ministers, 100 ministers, and the entire state resources were campaigning for one political party.
NGO mafia. This is a claim made by the executive of this country as well, saying that there is an NGO mafia. You are the chairman of Transparency International Sri Lanka, which is also an NGO operating in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
What is your take on this?
Well,
do you all have petty gains?
Well, I must say that people have been made to believe this propaganda of the government, and they think that when the civil society is challenging them on governance issues, on human rights issues, they need to challenge back those who make those voices. That is why the NGOs have been attacked. Let me tell you what an NGO is. First of all, we have to understand the word NGO came into being with the United Nations Charter in 1940s, where there's a reference to non-governmental organizations instead of civil society. Now, what is a civil society? It is basically this. If one person cannot act right on an important issue, then that person can join another person or a group of persons and form an association. If that association is outside the government, that becomes civil society. That is how a civil society comes in, and that is a recognized right, recognized even in Sri Lanka from time immemorial and globally used. And what we have seen is that this civil society has a space globally, except in dictatorial countries. And one yardstick to measure democracy in a country is how much space is given to civil society. What we have seen, unfortunately, is that there is a whole lot of attack, and most of these attacks are absolutely false. I can tell you one recently. There was a few years ago, the government media carried out news items without when we send even corrections, they never, saying that Transparency International got 260 million just before the 2010 election. That is utter false, because our accounts, for example, are always, anybody can go to tisrilanka.org, you will see all our, where we get money and so on and so forth. Everything is there. Now, this false information is basically planted to attack Transparency International, because Transparency International basically exposed election related corruption in this country. So to discredit that. Otherwise, if you look at the human rights issues or the governance issues, in my view, more than the opposition, the civil society and the NGOs are taking it up. Are you suggesting that civil society should not talk about it? That's not the case. Secondly, I must say that the fact that NGOs are getting money from outside is an accepted thing. I think if an individual can get money from outside for a project or whatever legitimate
but most of the countries that are supporting the US sponsored resolution against Sri Lanka are the countries that are supporting the causes of NGOs in Sri Lanka. Agreed or disagreed?
No, I agree and disagree, because you have to understand that in countries like Russia, China, Venezuela, or those countries don't have space for civil society so much in those countries, because they are also acting in like a group to stop the civil society operations globally. I mean, that is why in international forums they are together to attack those civil society spaces. But the countries with democracy, for example, you take Norway. Norway has been attacked here without understanding what Norway is. I mean, it has a fully fledged democratic system where the business sector is virtually owned by people and cooperatives and so on and so forth. So those countries have a mandatory investment, or they have to give money to civil society organizations. That's a mandatory requirement in their governance structure. And in the world today, we believe, and people do believe, that violations of fundamental rights in one country is a matter for other countries as well. It is no longer a matter of international or national issue. That's how we look at it. I mean, if there is, supposing there is a grave human rights violations in one country, others cannot wait, because that is no longer a matter for individual country. It is in that context that the civil society is given certain percentage of money in addition to individual.
My final question to you is, Mr. Valiamana, recently I saw in Ukraine a trash can challenge where individuals, where the civil society, where the public get together and throw the pictures of corrupt politicians into the trash. In Sri Lanka, how many politicians would we have to throw into the trash can if we are given that opportunity?
Well, the issue is, if you want to do that, you must be also prepared to go in a white van. But that's okay. You can challenge it. In my view, you must be open. You must be prepared to act collectively. In a challenge situation like this, where there is a fully pledged state capture, if one is going to take up the challenge, you will be in the trash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Valiamana, for joining us right here.
Thank you very much.
On Newsfirst in Focus. Pleasure to have you as always on the show.